Hello, everyone, and welcome back to part 4 of my interview with Jim Bennett, author of A Faithful Reply to the CES Letter. I have to say that this has been a very well-received series. I was expecting it to be very good, but I think I'm pleasantly surprised by how positive this interview series has been received, both by progressive Mormons, liberal Mormons, ex-Mormons, believing Mormons. There's obviously critics on both sides, but overall, people are, if you're a believer or a liberal, progressive Mormon, you're super grateful that I brought Jim on and you're very happy with the things Jim has said. And even if you're an ex-Mormon or a post-Mormon or non-believing Mormon, you're super grateful for Jim for coming on, for having a direct conversation, for the thoughtful way that Jim has comported and presented himself. And of course, there's a lot of, disagreement on the evidence and the facts, but overall, the reviews have been raving, positive. And I'm just thrilled that it's my fourth sit down, third technically, but fourth sit down with Jim, and then he's willing to come back for more. So Jim,
I can't shut up. That's the problem.
Welcome back to Mormon Stories.
Oh, thrilled to be here. I really enjoyed this. I can't emphasize just how much fun I find this. And maybe it's because I'm a glutton for punishment, but I just think I really enjoyed how respectfully you've conducted yourself. And I just think these are the kinds of discussions people ought to be having.
So this is the first interview we've done since I actually released, and you've been able to watch
right
2 of the premieres for parts 1 and 2. Part 3 hasn't aired yet. In part 3, we talk about LGBT stuff and racism primarily, and polygamy.
Yeah.
So that's going to be premiered on Monday before this is going to be premiered. But you've been able to watch the first 2.
Yeah. Well,
what are your reactions so far, or one?
Well, I've watched them both, but the second one I watched while it was premiering, and it reminded me why you probably should stay away from the comments, because I was watching the live chat throughout, and this was not a group that was particularly enamored of anything I had to say, and I kept being tempted as to what would be a great way to jump in. I thought at one point I'll just jump in and say, yeah, look how fat he is. What a fat guy that guy is, or something like that. But that was clearly a group of people that I don't know.
Well, what I was trying to encourage you is not to allow the comments to discourage you, because if these interviews were premiered on a Fair Mormon website or on an Orthodox Mormon website, the overwhelming feedback would be John's a bad person. John is evil. John, your questions are unfair.
Well, people say nasty things about you? I didn't realize. No.
But I mean, but because it's on the Mormon Stories podcast page, and most of those people are non-believers and critics, they're going to be critical of you. But that doesn't necessarily reflect the caliber, the quality of the interview, or the average person's response,
Well, I have been very grateful for the people who have reached out to me. I've met some delightful people through this who've reached out to me. This one woman sent me a message saying, I really enjoyed your perspective and it was wonderful. I'm going to send you a friend request on Facebook. I know you think I might be an axe murderer or something, but I'm really not, And I thought, that's great. I mean, I'm not doing this. I want to reiterate that I am not doing this to sort of convince people to come back to church necessarily. I mean, if they decide to come back to church because of this, then great. I would love that. But the people that are reacting negatively in that live chat are probably not people who are at a place in their lives where they're really considering whether or not they want to come back to church. I think they've probably made up their minds that they see the church as a fraud, and they see me as a defender of a church that is a fraud, as somebody that they don't really have a whole lot of time for. What I'm trying to do here is just demonstrate my own personal experience if as to how I have come to terms with these thornier issues and how I feel like I am, how I remain faithful, how I remain a believer. And if I think that has been useful to some people, and it is not at all useful to others, and I don't see any problem with that. I'm fine with that. And if you're watching this and you're saying, I am so sick, I read the comments, I'm so sick of just even listening to believers because they're all such deluded idiots. God bless you and keep you. I am where I am and you are where you are, and that's wonderful. But I'm not under any delusion that I have some kind of magical, or that I have all the answers, or that I'm somehow going to say something so brilliant and so powerful that even the most hardened disbeliever is going to decide, hey, I got to go to church on Sunday. That's not where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
So,
well, today, thank you for that. And thanks again for coming back. Thanks to all the listeners and viewers that have shared comments and questions. Let me tell you how the rest of this series is going to go. I've assembled a bunch of questions and comments from listeners and viewers. And there are also a few other topics that I wanted to cover, including women in the priesthood, feminism, the church's policy on porn and masturbation and sexual transgressions, one-on-one interviews, the handling of abuse, and then just the treatment of intellectuals and excommunication. So kind of a few final issues that I had hoped to cover with you last session. And then I've just got a bunch of responses, some critiques or, concerns with some of the framings, either in our interview or in the document that you created. And so we'll just go through as much as we can today. And there's a chance we'll come back for a fourth or fifth sitting to do a final Q&A. Is that okay?
Sure.
And I'll invite listeners and viewers, if your questions or comments don't get asked today, then still send them in and we'll try and cover them in our final sit down. Is that all right?
Yeah. I went on to Facebook and tried to answer actually some of the questions that people had posted there when you posted a call for them. So I don't know if we're going to go through any of those, but I've tried to engage some people on social media on some of these.
We'll cover some of these, and there'll always be time for more.
Okay.
You can't have enough Jim Bennett as far as I'm concerned.
I'm glad you feel that way, because I think there are plenty of people who have had enough Jim Bennett. So.
Okay, so we don't have to dig into these in any detail if you don't want, but let's just start. We talk about racism and LGBT stuff, but that leaves out a big chunk of the church. There's basically just the question of why are women, not allowed at the highest levels of decision-making in a substantive way? Why aren't half of our apostles women? Why aren't half of all bishops and bishopric members and stake presidency members women? Is our exclusion of women from decision-making and the highest levels of leadership at all the levels simply a holdover from a patriarchal society that goes back millennia? And, do you have opinions about that? And do you wish that would change? And do you see it changing?
I have opinions about it. I have a lot of opinions about it. And I think certainly traditionally, when the brethren are questioned about women in the priesthood, they cite tradition more than anything else. They cite the fact that Christ did not call any female apostles. They cite the fact that the prophets throughout the Bible and throughout the Book of Mormon have all been men, and cite the fact that the priesthood historically has been given to men and not to women. And that is correct. I push back and say, all right, but where is the revelation that limits the priesthood solely to men and not to women? And the fact is that revelation doesn't exist. The weight of the tradition and the weight of the patriarchal history is so massive that I don't think that a lot of people have been looking for that revelation to exist. I remember when Kate Kelly was at the forefront with Ordain Women, reading a lot of apologist statements saying, I'd be happy to accept women with the priesthood as long as that revelation comes that gives the priesthood to women. And as we've talked about here over and over again, those revelations don't come unless people are eagerly asking those questions. And I don't think we're seeing a lot of eager asking of those questions. And I think part of that too, and I don't know if this is Stockholm syndrome or anything else, but I don't think you're seeing a huge clamor from the women in the church to get the priesthood, which is very frustrating to Mormon feminists who insist, you're being oppressed. You need to do this. And a lot of women are in the church are saying, we're good. We're good. We're good.
Yeah.
So I don't see, I think where we are with LGBTQ issues is such that you are seeing so many people who are actively pressing for change that I think you're going to see changes in action in that regard far more quickly than you're going to see a shift in the willingness to grant authority to women, because you are not seeing that kind of a grassroots movement from the women in the church, for good or for ill. I'm not trying to say that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm saying it is what it is. Yes, I would like to see. I have my two oldest children are women. They're not girls. They're both women. They're both adults. My oldest is in medical school, and they're very much feminists, and they very much are pointing out to me how patriarchal the society they've been raised in is. And so I think I'm gaining a greater insight into that from that experience with my own daughters, and seeing how they look at the church, and they're frustrated that they see there isn't a leadership path for me at all in this church. I was talking to somebody who has left the church, who was a good friend of ours when we were in our ward, and they've left the church. And I was talking about the idea that one of the things that I think about quite a bit is, are people better or worse for being in the church? For instance, I used to talk to my father about, my frustrations growing up. I'd say, this guy's terrible. And his answer would be, yeah, but would he not be terrible if he weren't in the church? Is it the church that has made him terrible? And this response from this woman who has left the church was, women. Every woman in the church is worse off for being in the church, because the church is so oppressive, because the church does not allow them to stand equal to men. In the documentary that we're making, the one woman says there's never a circumstance where a man in the church can be overridden by a woman, where a man ever answers to a woman in any kind of a leadership capacity. And in the world, women are making great inroads in terms of being captains of industry and everything else. And so there's this increasing disconnect from professional, capable women who go out into the world and are respected for who they are and have every opportunity for leadership. And then they come in the church, and there's absolutely no possibility of them ever serving as a bishop or ever serving as they can serve as presidents of auxiliaries. But that always feels, and rightfully so, it's not appropriate to say that that's the same thing. A Relief Society president has power and influence in the Relief Society, but she answers to the bishop. She always answers to a man. So, I don't know. I think I may have wandered too far afield from what your original question was.
No, that was perfect.
But
so in your world, in your ideal, do you think that eventual revelation would come? Would you welcome that sort of revelation?
I would absolutely welcome that revelation. I'm not on the front lines picketing for it.
Partly because you don't believe that's effective, right?
Well, largely because I don't believe that's effective. Yeah, I do. I don't know that revelation is going to come quickly unless the women of the church are eager for it to come quickly.
Yeah.
And you could.
Who wants the job of a bishop?
Well, that's another story altogether. I've never been a bishop. I've been in 2 bishoprics, and it's always been a huge commitment just to be in a bishopric. And the amount of time and energy that I spend as a member of a bishopric is dwarfed by what the bishop actually has to do. So it's a huge, but at the same time, every bishop I've ever talked to, or the good bishops that I've talked to, and I guess every bishop that I know personally, I feel like has been a good bishop. I've been blessed in that regard because I know there are people who have bad experiences like that. But the bishops I have talked to, there is a spiritual fulfillment in that level of service and that level of sacrifice that, yes, it's a huge job and difficult and all that, but the reward, the spiritual reward is so great that all of them recognize that they have been given an opportunity and a blessing that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And the fact that a woman doesn't have that option makes me very, very sad. And I would like to see it change, but I don't think that petitioning for change is effective, and I don't see that change coming if the women of the church are not clamoring for it, and I don't see them clamoring for it on a large scale.
Yeah, that appears to be true. Okay, next topic. Thank you for that. I love that answer personally. Next topic is a delicate one for some. It's this issue of masturbation, pornography, and sexual transgressions. We often in 2021, and past 10 years, we talk a lot about LGBTQ issues. I think this issue of masturbation and pornography is kind of a more silent killer in the sense that it is causing a huge amount of anxiety and depression and even suicide in the church. But we don't talk about it, and everyone's afraid to talk about it, and it's a big deal. So do you have thoughts, just to begin with, and I have a couple follow-up questions around interviews and abuse.
Right.
But do you have thoughts about how the church handles pornography and masturbation?
I have many thoughts. We've discussed off camera. I'm trying to figure out how much of that discussion we've had that I want to share publicly, because let me give you a little background of my personal experience. And you are absolutely right talking about the anxiety, the silent killer, because even now, as I'm sitting here trying to talk to you about this, I'm more uncomfortable than I have been talking about anything else we've discussed, because I've had personal experiences here that I think led to a great deal of unnecessary anxiety as a teenager, even as a missionary. So this is a really fraught topic for me. So if I fumble, that's why. When I was 12 years old, I was given a copy of Boyd K. Packer's talk, To Young Men Only, or is it For Young Men Only? I'm not sure which the preposition it is. It was a little pamphlet. It was handed out to everybody in our deacons' quorum. It was right after he had given it in conference. And people make fun of this talk because, this is the little factory talk. I was 12 years old. I had no idea what he was talking about. Genuinely no idea. He talks about masturbation and never uses the word. And he is describing something, talks about this little factory, and everybody has a little factory, and you don't want a little factory to go into overdrive until the time that, I'm 12 years old. I'm completely sexually, I'm prepubescent at this point. I'm not sure exactly when puberty begins, but I had no idea what he was talking about. And I didn't know who to ask about it. And I asked my mother about it. And I love my mother. I don't think she really didn't know how to approach that with me either at that point in my life. And as I figured out what it was that he was talking about, I, to some degree, developed a fear of my own body. I thought, is there any kind of contact with my genitals constitute putting the little factory into overdrive? I mean, even as I say this, it's just so embarrassing to me to even think about this, because there was so much shame and so much guilt surrounding my exploration of what this was. I mean, I didn't even know what it was.
For listeners, can you explain the little factory kind of metaphor for our non-Mormon listeners? Because we have a lot of them.
Well, we have more than I thought. That we got this wonderful message from a pastor saying that he's enjoyed this. I'm a non-Mormon pastor
In the Midwest.
In the Midwest, it's like, thank you, Reverend. I appreciate that. Gosh, and see this. I'm so embarrassed. I'm sitting here flushing. I'm just so embarrassed. The little factory. Oh gosh, there's a valve. It's just.
Do you want me to try and summarize it?
Oh
or do you
yeah,
want to?
please. Let me
Okay,
out of
I'll
my
take
misery.
a stab at it. Boyd K. Packer, apostle, eventual president of the Quorum of the 12 of the Mormon Church, gives a talk where he basically likens the male reproductive system like a little factory, basically saying that it's like a factory that produces some sort of product,
A life-giving substance.
meaning semen, or meaning semen, I guess. And if you do anything to accelerate the production, that's sort of this almost self-fulfilling, self-feeding thing where you're accelerating the production in a way that isn't natural, and you're bringing on. Oh man, I don't even know how to justify the logic. But if you do anything to accelerate the production of the little factory, then it like escalates into really bad things. And so basically I guess the argument is that if you don't do anything to accelerate the production, it stays in this lower functioning mode until you're meant to have babies. And then there's this natural process that happens, but it's something about spilling the seed, and it's something about never doing anything to accelerate the production, or you reap this whirlwind of kind of like the production going into overdrive and causing you all sorts of problems. And I think whether it's Spencer W. Kimball, former Mormon prophet, or Boyd K. Packer, there's this idea that if you masturbate, then that leads to being gay, or that leads to becoming a rapist or a murderer, an axe murderer. And so if you don't do anything to stimulate the production, you're going to have the right level of passions and of production. But if you stimulate it, you're going to reap the whirlwind of evil, and you're going to become Ted Bundy, basically, or worse, a gay person. I don't mean to be
worse,
rude.
a gay person.
If you do anything to stimulate the production. Tell me where I got that wrong, or does that convey it?
Well, you actually used some sexual. I mean, when I was 12 years old, I didn't get any kind of sexual anything out. It didn't even seem sexual. It's, there's a factory, and you need to not. You can't open the valve prematurely, and it's like, what the hell? What are you talking about? I genuinely didn't know what it was. But as I came to understand what it was, and of course understanding everybody else's shame and embarrassment to even talk about it, there was not really a healthy environment where this was discussed. Certainly not in any kind of a church setting. I mean, you were handed this pamphlet almost in a brown paper envelope. We don't talk about this. Just read this quietly on your own, and really, the way I describe it is, it made me terrified of my own body. It made me terrified that I was going to do something, and this is just so embarrassing to even talk about. But I went through my adolescence not disturbing my little factory, in retrospect, I look at that and go, "Boy, Jim, you really." Had a whole lot of tension and all this kind of stuff that I think it was completely unnecessary. It was completely unnecessary. and so much shame and so much embarrassment and so much discomfort from something that I wasn't even willing or able or had the confidence or ability to talk to anybody about. So yeah, it's remarkable to me too. The little factory pamphlet is no longer distributed. So much so even that if you go back to the church's website, to the conference where Boyd K. Packer gave that talk originally, the talk is quietly removed. It's as if Boyd K. Packer never gave that talk. The church has quietly allowed that to just kind of fade off into the background, which is good, I believe. But gosh, there's so much pain and frustration and embarrassment that we have not dealt with. And this is not something I talk to with my friends about. This is not something I've had any conversations with. So let's fast forward to my mission interview. And I don't want to name names because I think people would know some of the names involved here. I will just say that I had, when I was going on my mission, I was interviewed and was asked questions about masturbation. And the leader did not believe my answers. And the questions were repeatedly invasive, made me extraordinarily uncomfortable. And here I was actually having paid attention to the pamphlet I'd gotten when I was 12 years old, even to the time I was 19 years old. And I was giving the answers that supposedly they wanted, and I wasn't being believed. And that created a cloud of uncertainty and difficulty while I was serving my mission. And I didn't even talk about that interview for at least 20 years after it took place. It felt abusive to me. I mean, I was 19. I wasn't a young kid. I don't recall any interviews as a young kid being asked about this. Actually, none of the bishops I had growing up ever asked me about masturbation or pornography. Pornography has never held any interest to me personally. It's just never been an issue for me. I think that's maybe strange or unusual, and I know it's something else for other folks, but it's just never, ever. My father always used to say, sex is not a spectator sport. So, I don't know. Anyway. So I don't have any kind of clean answer to that, other than to say that with my own sons particularly, I've been very open about this with them, to discuss this with them. I don't want them to experience this same kind of self-loathing in some ways, and the same kind of shame for things that they don't need to be experiencing shame and self-loathing over. I think you're absolutely right. Just my discomfort here in your raising it demonstrates that this is not something that as a church we have come close to dealing with adequately and confronting adequately, and that's where I am.
Do you have any type of idea of how to more effectively handle it? Like, I remember when a family member came to me and said, well, what, am I going to just tell my kids it's okay to masturbate, that it's healthy and normal? Like, that doesn't feel right. There's a lot of parents that are just terrified about that. Yeah. Or this idea of like, well, if you're permissive about pornography, then you make kids feel like it's okay, and you don't want that, right? And so, what is a more effective way?
Well, I see a lot of problems with pornography that don't necessarily have to do with how pornography is produced, how it exploits women particularly. Pornography, I think, can be extraordinarily destructive. So I don't think the answer is, oh, well, okay, no, pornography is great and all of that kind of stuff. With masturbation, I don't want to offer any kind of blanket advice to the church, nor do I want to get specific in the discussions I've had with my own sons about it. If that's a cop-out, that's a cop-out. I don't have an answer to that in any way that I think is helpful. I think that's something that we as a family are navigating. I know other people. I remember having a conversation with one friend, and she was talking about. She said to her sons, she said, "Oh, of course you masturbate. Just don't make it your full-time job." And she says, "And that's all. As long as they don't make it their full-time job." I'm like, well, if that's where you're landing with this, when I was in my first bishopric, now they put both handbooks online, but that's the first time I was given what was then the sort of secret handbook, the handbook only for leaders. And I searched that handbook, based on my own history. I wanted to know, okay, what exactly is the church's position on masturbation? And what I found in that handbook was pornography use is discouraged. And that was the only reference to pornography. And there wasn't a single reference to masturbation anywhere in the handbook.
That's right.
And so I looked at that and go,
the word, I couldn't find the word when I searched for it.
Well, the word certainly isn't in Boyd K. Packer's Little Factory Talk.
But no, it's not.
Handbook of Instructions. It's not in the Handbook of Instructions. So the idea that anybody's getting kicked out of the church over this, the fact that I would be asked in a mission interview solely about this. I'm a 19-year-old kid about to go out and spend 2 years away from my family, lonely and all that kind of stuff, going out into a hostile world and knocking on doors. And the most important thing you have to talk to me about is Really? That's it?
It's slightly worse than that, though, and I don't mean to pile on, but for me, you get this. There's this idea we in the ex-Mormon community or post-Mormon community, or even the progressive Mormon community, refer to as leadership roulette or ecclesiastical roulette.
Yep.
Where you'll get some bishops or stake presidents that are like, "Hey, everyone does it. Don't worry about it.
Right.
You're fine." And then you'll get these bishops that will literally keep you from going on a mission. They'll and alter the entire trajectory of your life.
Right.
Make you delay your mission or cancel your mission altogether. And that disparity just gives these leaders so much power. And it's so disconcerting that there can be such a disparity of responses, because if you get denied a mission, if you get sent home from the MTC early, or told you can't go on a mission, or told you have to wait 6 or 12 months,
right,
that can wreck your life, or at least seriously damage your life.
It absolutely can.
Yeah.
It absolutely does.
And that happens. I hear about that quite a lot. So that's a problem. So that's a, I had a second thought trailing that. So there's the ecclesiastical roulette thing, and then there's just kind of the impact that it has on people's lives. Both those things just seem just like way too much power, especially when you adjust for the fact that the word doesn't even appear in the manual. How is it that such carnage is being wreaked on people when it's not even something that's officially encoded in the Handbook of Instructions? And couldn't this be fixed very easily, right? With just like don't ask about it. Stop asking about it.
That's where we're going.
Yeah.
But we're not getting there with any kind of it's happening the same way that the shame and the embarrassment and all of that happens silently and quietly with nobody talking about it. The fact that we're sort of letting it go is happening with that same kind of silence and shame and embarrassment. It would be so refreshing if a church leader could come out and say, there is no ecclesiastical consequence to masturbation. You don't have to endorse it. You don't have to say, it's healthy, wonderful, and everybody does it. Just say there is no ecclesiastical consequence, period. And then let people deal with it. But I this is one of the reasons, incidentally, we're going to get to youth interviews.
Let's do that now.
Well, sure.
One-on-one interviews. So I'm sure you were paying attention when Sam Young was kind of leading his Protect the Children movement.
Yes.
Where he was talking about, number one, the inappropriate nature of one-on-one interviews with kids as young as 12, a bishop asking a young girl, do you touch yourself? Where do you touch yourself? There's that. And then there's leaders asking teens and young adults, again, women alone, where did he touch you? How did he touch you? Did you enjoy it? Did you orgasm? And I know these things are being made up. There are
No,
bishops,
they're not being made up.
There are bishops and stake presidents and stake high councils all over the world that feel like they have license to ask these super invasive, inappropriate questions that are often very explicit to children alone, young girls alone, young boys alone, women alone, men alone. And so your thoughts on, number one, one-on-one interviews that have sexually explicit questions, and just the appropriateness or inappropriateness of worthiness interviews in general, and of sexually explicit questions specifically.
When the church changed its policy to allow parents to sit in on interviews with their children, I was there sitting next to my sons with their first interview. And to his credit, my bishop didn't bat an eye, was very welcoming and said, this is great, wonderful. And the bishops that I've had, growing up, the bishops that I had I was never asked any of those kinds of questions. But I know people who were, and I was asked those kinds of questions when I left on my mission, in that interview that I described. There's no doubt in my mind that this is a pervasive problem. And I certainly believe that having a parent or an adult there is a great step forward. Would I like to see worthiness interviews disappear? I would. I absolutely would. I would not like to see teenagers not have a resource to turn to if they want to talk about these things. I mean, if somebody growing up and I think bishops can be a lifeline, particularly in families where a parent isn't necessarily going to be a sympathetic ear. The bishops that I have known growing up are bishops that I would have been entirely comfortable turning to if I didn't feel like I had the kind of support at home. But that conversation, first of all, should be initiated by the person seeking help rather than initiated by an authority figure who's going to sit there and grill you over things that I just, I don't see anything positive coming out of asking a young girl those kinds of questions. I mean, I don't even want to repeat the questions. It's just so invasive and wrong and abusive to me. I've always felt that way. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that is a great step forward to allow a parent to be in that room. But yeah, I would like to see those kinds of interviews go away. I'd like to see interviews and conversations between ecclesiastical leaders initiated by those who are seeking help. I think that's the direction we ought to be going.
I love that. One step further, it's a really difficult issue, is the church's historical handling of cases of abuse, of pedophilia, of incest, of family abuse, of ward member to ward member abuse, of Boy Scout leader abuse. And I've just over the years, part of the most difficult aspect of my job is reading these accounts of either bishops who are actual sexual or physical abusers to bishops or stake presidents protecting abusers, not reporting them to authorities, not reporting them to the police, encouraging victims to stay silent and not speak out about their abusers, and then even forgiving abusers and then putting them in a position where they're able to re-abuse children or boys or girls or women. And this just really heavy-handed involvement with Curtin McConkie, the law firm, where the church just seems, it reminds me in a slightly different way of the movie Spotlight, just where there's this systemic cover-up of abuse where the engines seem to be oriented towards protecting the abusers and the church's, assets legally and the church's reputation. Far more concern over that than prosecuting abusers and protecting the victims. Super sensitive topic. Do you have thoughts on that?
My wife will very much appreciate you plugging the movie Spotlight. She's watched that something like 5-6 times.
It's a great movie.
It's a great movie. It's a great movie.
Yeah.
And it demonstrates how essential it is that we shine light on this, the spotlight, that we bring this out into the open and deal with it. The church absolutely is not unique in the challenge that is facing, I think, all kinds of hierarchical religions, and the Catholic Church certainly has been the most high profile, have to deal with this. But I look at the Catholic Church and I say, okay, the vast majority of Catholic priests don't abuse their congregants, that don't abuse their parishioners. But those priests that don't are completely tainted and damaged by the large number that do. And the vast majority of leaders in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are entirely appropriate with their members. And so as a service to those leaders that are good, we need to root out and bring to light the ones that are not, the ones that are destructive, because it damages all of us. It damages the entire church. And again, we're getting better at it, but there's no question this is a problem, and there's no question that we should take any effort necessary to be able to bring it to light and make sure it doesn't happen anymore. And the idea of eliminating, sexually, I didn't experience this firsthand, but I remember it used to be a question in the Temple Recommend interview. They would ask questions about sexual behavior between married couples. Oral sex, I think, was raised as an issue, and that quietly went away when it became clear that isn't helpful to anybody. It's none of your business to ask about the sexual practices of a married couple that is covenantally, that's not appropriate at all. But that change happened quietly. It didn't happen. It didn't say we were wrong, we made a mistake, and we're going to bring this out into the open. I really feel like to root out the evil of sexual predation, that we need to root it out as publicly and apologize and put in place procedures necessary to make sure that never happens. I feel very strongly about that, and I don't think that's an indictment of the church as a whole. I think this is something that we are wrestling with as the mortal family. Sexual predators are with us, and organizations where people under color of authority can abuse people with less authority. You find that in and out of the church, but you absolutely do find it in the church, and we need to root it out and bring it to light and get rid of it.
Thank you. So as we kind of think about the issues we've been covering today and that we've covered on past episodes, and this is going to be slightly repetitive to themes. We're kind of revisiting some themes we've already discussed, but whether we're talking about Jeremy Runnell and the CES Letter and or me, or Bill Reel, right? Those are three people who tried hard to speak openly and publicly about problems with the church's treatment of history and or other issues. And they were, we were all excommunicated, right? Or in Jeremy's case, he resigned right before he was excommunicated. We're talking about Kate Kelly and how she tried to bring attention to, the church's treatment of women. She was excommunicated. We talk about Sam Young and his attempt to bring to light the church's handling of sexual matters and of these one-on-one worthiness interviews Sam Young was excommunicated. This kind of brings me back to a question I asked you earlier, and that's just this idea of how the church, on the one hand, you seem very, in such an encouraging and refreshing way, willing to acknowledge all the problems, all of these problems that these sort of activists have brought to light. You sort of say, I share all these concerns. And yet these issues weren't really on the radar as much. They weren't part of the public discourse before each of these people kind of did their work. And then at a minimum, now these issues are either great changes have already been made, like in the example of one-on-one interviews, or the essays, or the Joe Smith Papers Project, or, improvements around women in the church, whatever. We've seen progress as a result of a lot of these activists in efforts, but then it has to give pause to an Orthodox or a believing member to say, "Wow, how can I be so grateful for those changes?" Acknowledge that the changes happened as a result of these activists doing what they do, and yet acknowledge that the church's response to these activists for making efforts that led to this positive change was to excommunicate them. And I know you've already addressed this, but I just want to ask you again, what are your thoughts or feelings around the excommunication of people like me, Jeremy, Bill, Sam, Kate Kelly, and others? And do you have thoughts or feelings around the church's treatment and or excommunication of the very people that are helping to be responsible for the change that is happening? And do you wish that the church would handle these sorts of people in a different way?
I don't think you're going to like my answer. I'm just warning you in advance. I think a lot of people aren't going to like my answer because I'm not willing to second guess the leaders who took action against you or Sam Young or Kate Kelly or anybody else. I'm not willing to say they shouldn't have excommunicated you. And I recognize that's a cop-out.
Why is that a cop-out?
Well, because based on what I know of you personally, I don't know Kate Kelly, I don't know Sam Young, but based on our conversations, if you were to come to me and say, would you, Jim Bennett, if you were the stake president, would you excommunicate John DeLynn? My answer would be no. I wouldn't. But I'm not your stake president. And I'm not in that position, and I don't feel it's appropriate for me to judge your stake president. So I don't think that's satisfying enough to people who go, well, Jim Bennett, you're willing to acknowledge that John DeLynn is a good guy and that you wouldn't excommunicate him. So why won't you come out and say he shouldn't have been excommunicated? Because I don't think that's a productive way to engage with the church. I think the church, the challenge of the church and challenge of dealing with leaders is dealing with the messiness that comes with the kind of leadership roulette that you've described. So I'm not willing to put myself out on that limb. So maybe it's cowardly of me to say that, but that's kind of where I am on that. In bishoprics, in the 2 bishoprics I've been involved in several disciplinary councils. And it's remarkable to me and maybe even somewhat ironic, that I consider those councils to be some of the most spiritual experiences I've had serving in the church. I never had a council for apostasy, never had a council that was disciplining anybody that hadn't sort of even reached out to deal with challenges they were having in their lives. And the leaders in those councils, the bishops, both bishops in those councils, were so clearly trying to seek the mind and the will of the Lord in how they would handle them, and were doing everything they could to minister to the people who were involved. And that ministry didn't stop when the council was over. These were people that the bishop, after it's done, reaches out to them and is doing all they can. Okay, so how can we get your life back on track? That was the goal. The goal was not, okay, how can we punish you for the terrible things you've done? How can we, and so I saw those as extraordinarily positive experiences, which I don't think a lot of people would think of. So I'm coming at it from that context too. I think that disciplinary councils should always be that kind of a positive thing. I don't see a lot of value in punitive disciplinary councils. When I was a missionary, there was a circumstance in a tiny, far-flung part of Scotland where there were essentially competing congregations. They met in a community center, and the branch president would set up a meeting on one side of the community center, and then the followers of this other guy would come into the same room, set up chairs with their backs to the chairs of the rest of the congregations, and try to set up a competing sacrament meeting. And that ended up in a lot of people being excommunicated. And I look at that and say, okay, that kind of makes sense to me. If your goal is to attack, to destroy, then excommunication becomes the last resort. I would like to see excommunication only be a last resort. And I think there have been too many times where it has not been, where it has been, okay, this is somebody we don't quite know what to do with. Okay, this makes us uncomfortable. Much easier just to sort of toss them aside. And I don't appreciate that approach. I wouldn't take that approach were I to be a church leader. I don't anticipate being a church leader, actually, that would
especially now.
Maybe not now. Maybe I'm too radical. And well, actually, I remember one of the comments reading on YouTube is like, "You're talking to this guy, but he's going to be excommunicated soon, so watch out."
For coming on the podcast.
Yeah.
Which I think is silly.
I know my bishop and I know my stake president. Yeah. I've had conversations with them, and if somebody excommunicates me for coming on here and trying to defend the church, mm-hmm. which my primary goal is to represent where I am in my faith, but where I am in my faith leads me to defend the church. And if I'm going to be excommunicated from that, then I don't know what else I can do.
So when you were explaining what you call the cop out, what I was worried that you were basically saying was that maybe there are other reasons we were excommunicated beyond our activism. And you don't want to second guess that, like maybe we're secret adulterers, pornographers, or cheating on, whatever it is.
I'm not trying to give that implication at all.
No, I didn't think you were, and I'm glad I didn't get that sense. What I got the sense, if I looked at all these excommunications, Lee and Cody Young included, I got two impressions. One is that basically, if that talking openly about church history in a way that isn't framed faithfully, like let's say, like obviously Richard Bushman and Terrell Givens and you and others can talk about church history, but they're always framing it couching it in a faithful context. And so, yes, you can talk openly about, difficult topics as long as you couch it in, it's all true, the church is true, and Joseph Smith was still a prophet, and the Book of Mormon is still true, so here's how I reconcile that. And then you could talk about difficult things. But if you openly talk about difficult things in a way that is like either neutral or skeptical, one, And then two, if what you talk about has too much of an impact, if it reaches too many people, if it starts to have an influence. And I don't want to say that Jeremy's ever caused people to leave the church, that I've ever caused people to leave the church. And I don't even think most of the people I know that I've mentioned that our desire was ever to cause people to leave the church. It was more to say, we've run into problems and we think these are serious problems and we don't understand we don't find satisfying answers to these problems. And as a result, people are and our platform started to have a really big impact of people leaving, not because of us, but because of the problems. Then the church is uncomfortable with the open expression of those concerns in a non-faithful context. And then that's when the excommunication comes. Or that's one problem. One reason I felt for these excommunications is too big of an impact in a non-faithful way. And then the second is that the brethren, if you had to say that the brethren have one superpower, in the minds of faithful members, or if they have one really root or source of power inspiration, it's their claim that they have privileged access to God and that their decisions are led by God. And so if there are changes to be made regarding women or LGBT people or the way the church talks about history, or race, it can never be viewed that the brethren are responding to social pressure, that they're caving to activists or criticism. And so if they are to make a change with regards to race or LGBT or its treatment of history or women, it has to do this unsavory sort of move of making the change, but never making it look like they were doing it in response to social pressure. And so you have to excommunicate Sam Young before you make the change regarding one-on-one interviews. You have to excommunicate Kay Kelly before you ever make a change regarding women. You have to excommunicate John or Jeremy or Bill Reel, as you're making changes so that it never appears like you're caving to social pressure. And so that's honestly my most objective and even charitable interpretation of why people like us have been excommunicated. Not because of any hidden sins or even because we are trying to tear down the church. Any thoughts on those two things?
Yeah, I think the concern that the church doesn't want to look like it's caving is real, and I think it's unnecessary. I really feel like it's unnecessary. We've talked about this over and over.
Because your whole premise is that
revelation comes when it's needed.
Exactly, and it's the activists or the critics that often.
And if the critics are raising something that causes leaders to ask a question and get an answer,
they shouldn't be punished for that in theory.
Well, but it's there shouldn't be any effort to pretend that something else is happening, right? A lot of people who talk about the priesthood ban, for instance, they exalt the fact that it came in 1978 after the heat of the civil rights movement. So clearly it wasn't happening as a result of this kind of pressure. It happened in a vacuum. This revelation just sort of came out of the ether. That's not helpful. It happened because of extraordinary amounts of pressure that were brought to bear on the church as the church tried to justify racism and exclusion. So I just look at that and I just get exasperated by the idea that it's an ideal to somehow claim that any change hasn't been precipitated by something that has happened. That there hasn't been a catalyst, and that the catalyst might have been somebody that you don't like, or somebody. I just see that as, why is that something we're even trying to do? And that's a question independent of whether or not you or anybody else should have been excommunicated. It's, why are we even pretending that Sam Young raising the issue of one-on-one interviews had no bearing whatsoever on church leaders asking questions to the Lord about one-on-one interviews? Why? What do we benefit from that? What is the gain from that? I just don't see one. So,
and then following that, if you not to condemn that decision, if you were to give your observation as to the impact on church membership to excommunicate me, Kate Kelly, Jeremy Runnell, Sam Young, Lee and Cody Young, and others, what do you observe? Do you think that has helped the church? Do you observe some negative or even really damaging consequences to that treatment?
I think there are visible and measurable consequences to it, but I think the intangibles make it more difficult for me to say conclusively.
I'll tell you the argument, because there's a lot of people that, there's no question that starting in 2014, the church started losing people, in an accelerated fashion, as far as I'm concerned.
Why that year?
That's the year Kate Kelly was excommunicated.
Oh, okay.
And then I was excommunicated in 2015. And then, after that, there's Rock Waterman, there was the Calderwoods. There was this whole host of excommunications kind of plus or minus 2015.
I don't know the Calderwoods. I may be related to them. I'm a Calderwood somewhere.
Oh, cool. Yeah, Carson and Marisa Calderwood, they're great. But anyway, what I heard by thousands of people is that if the church doesn't want John DeLynn, they don't want me, right? Okay. Or if the church doesn't want Kate Kelly, then they don't want, I'm a feminist. If the church doesn't want Kate Kelly, they don't want me. And, or if the church, excommunicates its earnest critics like Bill Reel or whatever, then the church is actually acting like it has something to hide, or it's acting like it's afraid, or it's insecure. That's kind of the argument. And I think there's a lot of evidence that these excommunications were the final straw for a lot of people. I would say thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. All these resignations that have come through Quit Mormon starting around, that time, I would observe that the church would have been a lot more effective to work with people like us than to kick us out, because it just sends a message to a lot of people that they're not wanted either, and that the church has something to hide, or that it's acting in a medieval or a barbaric way, a way that isn't fundamentally Christ-like,
I think you can make that argument. I think the church's challenges with people leaving the church, I think the excommunications are symptomatic of an underlying challenge. And the underlying challenge is that in the age of the internet, people are discovering things and learning about things in a way that the church does not have the capacity to mediate. So I would take a broader look at that and say it's not just that John DeLynn is being excommunicated, or that any of these other people are being excommunicated. It's that people are discovering information that they find troubling, and they don't see the church having an adequate vehicle to confront it and to deal with it. And then they can point to people who, okay, well, these people are trying to deal with it and they're not dealing with it in a way that the church finds acceptable. And so maybe I'm not acceptable, and I can't stick around for that. I can absolutely see that happening. I think things like that would be likely to happen even without excommunications. I mean, when I say why that year, it's just because I think you were seeing, you're seeing in the age of the internet that kind of a difficulty, and and a challenge that I think is not tied to an individual. I think it's tied to just the general infrastructure and framework of how the church functions, and the church is having to adapt to figure out how to do that. You know, I think I mentioned on here before that there are half as many active members in the church in Scotland as there were when I served there as a missionary 30 years ago. I don't think that has to do with your excommunication or anybody else's excommunication. I think all throughout Europe, you're seeing the church essentially implode. And it very much has to do with the fact that we have not figured out a way to engage people where they are in their doubts and their questions and in their frustrations with the church. And we can't just wave it away and say, you know, it's Elder Ballard's great talk to the CES leaders, you know, gone are the days when, you know, someone comes to you with a question and you can just bear your testimony and shut them down. Gone are the days when you can just say, don't worry about it. I think the church has been slow to recognize that, and we're in the process of recognizing it. But I think it's a larger problem than any individuals. I think it's a systemic problem that we're being forced to come to terms with, whether we like it or not.
To kind of close out this part, and then I want to go to the Q&A. There's two kind of final questions I want to ask. One is, when you hear Elder Snow, the church historian, talk about the Gospel Topics essays that were released, there was an explicit acknowledgement that the church felt really torn about these Gospel Topics essays. There's almost a sense that it was a legal maneuver, that they needed some sort of public evidence acknowledging these problems so that they wouldn't be subjected to lawsuits about people not being informed, not having informed consent, that they wanted, that they were almost released under some sort of motivation of plausible deniability, where it's like, hey, nope, look, we talked about peepstones and we talked about polygamy, kinderhook plates. Here's the place on the website where we talked about it. But the Elder Snow and others have acknowledged that these essays were intentionally not advertised to the general membership. They were not, they've never been mentioned in a general conference ever. And by the people who follow this, they're buried several levels deep, you know, in the church's navigation structure. They are on the app. So you could have different people. They come up
very quickly in a Google search. You Google race and priesthood.
They do, but you have to know. But that's the thing, you have to know about them. You have to know it exists. Yeah, and you have to know. And I think the strongest evidence of this is that if you go to most, like, people write me every day in 2020, you know, it's 2021 now, but in 2020, I would get emails all the time saying, I had a faith crisis. I went to my bishop to talk to him about it. He had never heard about these issues. And then I said, well, you know, then the person says, well, read the Gospel Topics essays. And then the Mormon bishop says, what are the Gospel Topics essays? So that even to this day in 2021, I would venture to say most Mormon bishops in the United States have possibly never heard of the Gospel Topics essays, and or if they have, they've never really read them. And if they have, they've never really considered them. So this is a problem that the church, I think, could solve. They could blast it all, put it on the front page of their home website. They could talk about it in any general conference. They could bring you and Brian Hales and Terrell Givens, you know, create training where they educated all the bishops and the bishoprics and the stake high councils and the Relief Society presidencies. They could do a mass education of the problems, and not just historical stuff, but LGBT stuff, race stuff, you know, and not just in the U.S., but also globally. They could solve this problem, or at least go a long ways towards solving the problem. But my understanding of why they haven't done that is because it's viewed like a virus. That that the only way the church sees to address this problem is on a once they're infected basis. That you only want a
vaccination.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. But it seems like the way that the church has chosen to handle this up until now, not counting seminary and institute, but I'll just say with the membership 20 years and above, right? 30 years and above for sure, is to only handle it on a once you have a crisis basis, And it's not by training the bishops, because the bishops aren't trained. It's like, well, we'll send Terrell Givens or Fiona on a fireside, or we'll send Richard Bushman to a fireside. We'll only invite those people who need to know, or we'll bury these essays in a place where people can find them if needed. But it's in a very reactive way and not a proactive way, because if you try and handle this in a proactive way, you end up spreading the virus. Because if you start training bishops and bishoprics and stake presidents and stake presidency members and stake high councilmen and relief society presidents and mission presidents, if you start proactively training them, you're going to spread the virus a lot more fast than if you just wait for it to spread kind of in a reactive way. So that's a separate question from the inoculation sort of changes in curriculum that we're starting to see with the book Saints, that we're starting to see in the changes to the seminary and institute curriculum. But how do you respond to that fear that the brethren, by many accounts, have, that they can't be proactive about addressing this problem, lest they risk spreading it on a pandemic level?
On a pandemic level.
Throughout the membership.
How do I respond to it?
Do you think there's some
sure. Well,
plausibility to that?
I've gotten pushback on my CES letter reply, even from Jeremy, about the Streisand effect. The idea. Barbara Streisand had a picture of her house. If anybody doesn't know what this is, and
yeah, tell us.
Well, I don't know if I remember the details correctly, but she had a picture of her house that she didn't want anybody to see, and she sued to make sure it wasn't seen. So of course everybody went to find it. If she had just kept her mouth shut, no one would have known that this picture existed. And I've been accused of a sort of Streisand effect and Jeremy, in his first email to me, when he was really kind of mad at me, he says, your CES letter reply is introducing everybody to the issues that are in the CES letter, and the issues in the CES letter are so compelling that you, Jim Bennett, by calling attention to it, are driving people out of the church. And my reaction to that, and my reaction to the broader question you've just raised, is we don't have any choice. We don't have any choice. I think that there are well-intentioned people who want to sort of keep this information from being viral and being spread and being out there. And I think their intentions are entirely honorable in doing so. But the genie is out of the bottle. We don't have any choice. Everybody has access to this information now. So are they going to get this information from Mormon Think, which probably isn't as charitable in how they're going to present the information as the Gospel Topics essays would be? Where are they going to get this information, and how are they going to get it? And the conversation can't be anymore, how do we shield people from this information, or how do we introduce it to them in a way that, the fact is, it's there. It's there, and it's so easily accessible. When I was a missionary, you'd be teaching somebody, and in a little brown paper bag, a minister would give them a pamphlet telling them about all the terrible things about the church. And in 1988, that's the only way you got terrible information about the church. In 2021, you type the name of the church into Google, and it's all there in the first search. It's all there. So I listen to that, and I just think the reason I'm doing what I'm doing is because eventually people who are uncomfortable having these conversations with a John DeLynn or with a Jeremy Runnell or somebody else, they're going to have those conversations. You're postponing them. You are not avoiding them. Those conversations are going to happen because these are real questions that people have, and they're going to be asking them, and we need to figure out not how to avoid them, but how to answer them. And if I'm not answering them perfectly or even adequately, that's on me. But we have to make that attempt. We just have to get out there and we have to engage. So I just feel very strongly and passionately about this, that we just don't have a choice. It's so bizarre that people think, it's like Donald Trump challenging the election. It's like, well, should we acknowledge or not acknowledge that he lost the election? Well, it doesn't matter what you acknowledge or don't acknowledge. He lost the election, right? This is objective reality. And the objective reality is that there are issues in the history of the church that people have questions about, and they're looking for answers. And we need to be willing to provide them. I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah. My guess is there's this calculus that goes on where they've basically made the decision that to handle it the way they've handled it is the best way to lose the least amount of people. So I imagine them sitting in these sort of strategy meetings where they say, okay, we're either going to lose, 40,000 members a year to this kind of stuff, or we could lose 80 or 100,000 members a year to this stuff. So by going the slow route, by putting the essays in kind of a hidden place, by not broadcasting them in general conference, we're going to lose 20 to 40,000 a year, but we won't lose 100,000. And so they've basically made the decision that this kind of piecemeal, slower approach is the most effective way to minimize the damage that's inevitable. And my question to you is, in your observation, is this kind of piecemeal reactive approach the right path in your estimation of losing the least amount of people versus accelerating the amount of people? Because there is the community of Christ approach where it's like make too many changes too quickly and then you get this mass defection. Do you feel like the way the church is handling it is actually potentially, do you see evidence of the possibility that the way the church is handling it in a slower, more piecemeal, more indirect, more reactive way is actually creating more problems for itself in the long run? Or do you even have enough evidence to speculate in that way?
Well, the last part of your question is where I was going, because if you make Jim Bennett president of the church, and there are going to be some changes, right? And my rant just a minute ago is how I personally would approach this. The way
is it?
Yeah.
With the goal of minimizing the defections?
No, I mean,
or just doing the right thing. Because there is a lot of people are like, well, John, what would you do if you could talk to the brethren? And I have talked to the brethren.
Sure, I have too.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, we can talk about that if you want. But I know rule one of wanting to talk to the brethren more than once is to never talk about your conversations with the brethren. And that, but when when I've tried to think about if I were to talk to Elder Holland, what advice would I give him? But I always had the rule, it's got to be advice that's actually good for the church. And when I say good for the church, I mean butts in seats and tithing. And that's not to say that that's all the church cares about, but I think those are things the church can track. If tithing goes down, or if attendance goes down, or if resignations go up, you maybe have made some bad decisions. And I honestly don't know that I could look Elder Holland or Uchtdorf or Nelson or Oaks in the face and say, legalize same-sex marriage, do same-sex marriage in the temples, and come 100% clean proactively with all your history. I could not look them in the face and say that's going to be the best way to minimize the defections. I think that might accelerate defections. And so anyway, that's just my disclaimer. Now, what's yours?
No, my disclaimer.
Or your answer.
Well, because I begin by saying, you put Jim Bennett in charge of the church and he's going to do it this way. But I'm not in charge of the church. And not only am I not in charge of the church, I don't have access to the amount of voluminous research.
Right.
Because I don't think these decisions are made on the basis of pettiness the church does an extensive amount of research. I've received a number of surveys. I received one that talked all about grace that I thought was just beautiful. They made all these, they gave me all of these statements. Do I agree with this statement about grace or this statement about grace? And I went, somebody in church leadership wants to know what the membership thinks about grace. And isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
And I thought, that's great, but so you go through that. And so I am sure that the approach they are taking can be justified by a great deal of research. That this is not just any apostle or any 70 or anybody in church leadership flying by the seat of their pants. I think they firmly believe they have data and evidence to which I do not have access. So I qualify my sweeping kind of call for total transparency like that with an understanding that they clearly, on this case, not just even sort of in a spiritual way, but they have hard data that I don't have. So if I had that hard data, I might change my mind. I look at that, though, when you start talking about in terms of accelerating the defection, or, how do we do this in terms of, do you want to bleed slowly or do you want to rip the Band-Aid off all at once? Because if people are going to defect from the church, if they're going to leave the church over these issues, how much of a difference does it make if they leave them slowly over time or they all leave at once? What I think we don't have any choice but to do is, if people are going to defect over these, they're still going to have access to the information, right? You're not, by giving it to them and doing your best to frame it for them in a faithful context up front, are more people going to leave than if they are left to sort of discover this on their own? Well, I don't think in aggregate, in total, that more people would leave. I think more people would leave. The people who are going to leave will leave quickly. They'll leave now as opposed to later. But I don't think those people who are going to leave later wouldn't leave later if we were upfront with them now. So second guessing the church and doing all of that, I absolutely believe that these men are operating with the best of motives. And I absolutely believe they have access to hard data that I do not have access to. So any kind of sweeping change that I advocate is qualified by the fact that I'm ignorant to some degree. But the broad principle applies. And the broad principle applies to what I personally feel like is my responsibility in how I've engaged in this world with my CES letter reply and with these kinds of conversations, is that I feel like I have no choice but to directly engage with people with the hardest possible questions. And I think the only way we save people in the church and keep people in the church is to model and demonstrate that people with integrity can confront these issues and stay. That's what caused me to stay. I look at that Gilbert W. Scharf's book. I had a chance to meet Gilbert W. Scharf's after I came home from my mission, and I thanked him profusely for his book.
This is the response to the God Makers.
This is the response to the God Makers.
Yeah.
I've never seen the God Makers movie. I read the book.
It's on the internet. It's great.
Yeah,
it's only an hour.
I've seen the cartoon.
Yeah.
Where God has gazillion wives and it comes from Starbase Kolob and blah 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 blah. But what Gilbert W. Scharf's did for me was not. He was a model. He was an example. He was okay. He did it. This guy's smart. This guy has integrity. This guy seems like a good guy. If he can do it, then maybe I can do it. I think that's the only approach that works. I don't think any approach where it's like, well, we're going to not tell you some information because we're going to skewer it. We're going to, that approach doesn't work. That approach doesn't stop doubt. What stops doubt is a doubter seeing somebody who has wrestled with doubt come out on the other side and seeing a path forward. I really don't believe that people want to leave the church and are eager to doubt.
No.
I don't think that's been your experience.
No.
I don't think that was Jeremy's experience.
No.
Jeremy talks about reading this stuff on the internet and just, I need answers now. It's why he reached out to a CES director. It was not because I want to leave the church. It's I want to stay. I desperately want to stay. How do I stay? And that's the question we need to answer. This is how you stay. Not, oh, you're wrong for even questioning. You're wrong for even doubting. What do you mean, how do you stay? You know, when I express public frustration with the 2015 policy, the reaction largely was, get out. It's like, I don't want to get out. I want to stay. How do I stay? You don't stay. Get out. You're faithless. Get out. That's not an approach that helps the church in the long run or the short run, or doesn't help anybody.
Really quickly, and then I have a final question for this segment. What is your reaction to the Gospel Topics essays and the book Saints and other, well, I guess I should start by saying your response to Jeremy's CES letter has been at least indirectly endorsed by the church a little bit, right? Wasn't it advertised, I guess, by Fair Mormon?
Well, Fair Mormon, yeah. Fair Mormon came to me, and it was actually Book of Mormon Central. I went and met with Book of Mormon Central, and they told me they would like to advertise my reply, that they had some information that the CES letter, that my reply was the most effective response to the CES letter. And so there were a few months where they spent some money, and you saw advertisements for my reply. I saw precisely $0 of any of that money. Like, do I get paid for this? No. Okay, all right then. Off we go. But the essays, I remember reading, the first essay I read was the Race and the Priesthood essay. And I saw that it had come out. I mean, they didn't hide it from me. I think I run in circles where people talk about these things. So I read it right when it came out, and I braced myself for it because I thought, oh, really, are we going to get into all of the excuses, the torturous excuses that I tried to make on my mission for why we really weren't being racist and why it really was an exclusionary? That's the document I was expecting. And so when I read the actual essay, I was thrilled. It struck me as being, it acknowledged racism. It acknowledged that there isn't a revelation that authorized this. It acknowledged that the black people are not bearing the curse of Cain, and and I was flabbergasted. You know, I know so many people point to those essays as catalysts for faith crisis, but it was a huge boon to me. I loved it. And the other essays that have come out, I have loved. I could do without a few months shy of her 15th birthday. I read that and just went, oh, really, guys?
The polygamy essay.
No. Yeah. They talk about Joseph's marriage to a 14-year-old as marriage to a woman, Helen Mar Kimball, as being, she was a few months shy of her 15th birthday. You know, a friend of mine who's left the church said, yeah, that means she was 14. So yeah, you have some of that, but not nearly as much as I was expecting. I thought they were candid. I thought they were upfront, which may be why they don't want to advertise them as widely. But the Saints, the book Saints, I devoured I haven't read the second volume yet, but I devoured the first volume in installments as it was released online. I eventually got the printed version, but I was reading it because they were releasing it chapter by chapter online. And I just thought, this is a breath of fresh air. This is absolutely how we deal with this. I mean, you acknowledge the rock in the hat. You acknowledge the challenges of polygamy. You acknowledge all of them, and you put them in the broader context of the church, because I don't think we should be ashamed of our history. I think we should embrace our history in its totality, because there is so much beauty there. There's so much sacrifice. There's so much faithfulness. And yes, there are also so many problems and so many things that are messy. That is the human mortal experience. That is it. You know, growing up, we talked about church history in the context of our pioneer history. And we would just celebrate and embrace all of that, and look how much sacrifice and look how noble these people were. All of that is still true. All of that is accurate. All these people were amazing, remarkable pioneers. And we can celebrate them so much more when we acknowledge them as people and not as these sort of demigods that came down from Mount Olympus and did all these things. These were people with problems, and they made a mess of some stuff. I've made a mess of some stuff. Everybody does. That's what life is. But, so I look at what the church has done with that, and just I'm thrilled with it in terms of the content. I am not thrilled that it's not getting the wider audience that it should. Although Saints is kind of being pushed. There was a guy in my ward who came up to me and said, he was reading Saints, and he says, "Are you related to John C. Bennett?" And I went, "Absolutely not. Absolutely not. John C. Bennett's the worst." "Oh, he is? Oh, I haven't gotten to that part yet."
Oh.
Yeah, he's just come into the story, and he seems like he's a good guy. I just wonder if you were related. I'm like, okay, keep reading. Keep reading. You won't like him as you get further in. So, and the Joseph Smith papers. The Joseph Smith papers, I think, are really spectacular. The other thing that I think is spectacular, I checked out a copy of Richard Turley's book, Mountain Meadows Massacre, or Massacre at Mountain Meadows, I think it's called. That doesn't pull any punches at all. And, I spent 3 years in St. George when I was the artistic director at Tuacahn. And I had grown up completely ignorant of all of the stuff in southern Utah. The Tuacahn did the story of Jacob Hamblin. I had no idea who Jacob Hamblin was. And the Mountain Meadows Massacre, I remember driving out to the site of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It was about 45 minutes from where I lived. And just being in a real, I had the same kind of feeling I had when I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. There's a feeling of reverence there, but also just this abject recognition of horror, of all that kind of thing. And Richard Turley's book, authorized by the church, written by the church historian at the time, lays out just it's like watching a movie where the ending, the tragic ending, and you keep wanting to tell the characters, no, don't do that, no. And they do that, and they go there. So, yeah. This is a long answer to your question, but I'm very happy with a lot of what we're doing now.
Sure.
And I think it's a vast improvement over what we have done.
Moving in the right direction.
But I am not as happy with the pace at which it is being rolled out and introduced to the membership.
Yeah. Okay, last question for this section. Oftentimes I'm demonized, Jeremy's demonized, and I'm really grateful for how you've been willing to stand up for people like me and Jeremy and denounce our demonization. I really profoundly appreciate that. But oftentimes so many people accuse me and Jeremy of like leading people out of the church, destroying testimonies, destroying faith. There's even this Cardinellis guy who's like, John's a homewrecker for profit. And one of the things that I often think about is, what does it say about God? And what does it say about his plan of salvation for his children? And what does it say about his one true church? If, in the case of Jeremy Runnell, some, 30-something with a laptop,
how fragile a God that is.
Some deaf kid, some deaf middle-aged white kid with a laptop can create a PDF, and just with that, kick tens of thousands of people out of God's one true church. Or in my case, some tall, goofy kid from Texas can buy a microphone and start a podcast. and literally devastate the salvation, in terms of like celestial kingdom of like tens of thousands of Mormon families. The church is already, the LDS church already is such an incredibly low percentage of the world's population, less than 0.5%. We talk about 16 million members. There's only 5 to 6 million active members at best, and only a third of those are really temple attending, tithe paying. So, I mean, we're talking about a couple million people in a world of billions. Like, we're already kind of really behind the curve. What does it say about God, the one true church, and the plan of salvation? This narrative that just a podcast or a PDF posted to the internet can devastate not just, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of families, but their posterity as well. Like that argument that Jeremy and I are powerful enough, or Bill Reel, or RFM, or Kate Kelly, or whatever, that we're powerful enough to literally destroy the future salvation of tens of thousands of the Lord's children and their families. What do you make of that argument?
What do I make of that argument?
Are we that powerful?
No.
Is that what's going on?
Well,
is that what's happening? Is it our fault?
Well, are you that powerful? I think the other question is the church that fragile?
Right.
Is God that fragile?
Right.
Is God that weak?
Yeah. And is the hatred towards us, the demonization of us, justified? I want both answers.
I don't think the demonization is justified because okay, let's say that it is. Let's, for argument's sake, say you are the worst person who has ever lived. Adolf Hitler's got nothing on you, right?
And that's some would argue that's the church's position. Outer darkness, who gets it? Not Hitler.
Right,
not Jeffrey Dahmer. Mass murderers, rapists, they're in the celestial kingdom.
We're violating Godwin's law now.
I'm just saying it's you could make an argument that Joseph Smith's theology is the only people that go to true Mormon hell are the ones who believed and then turned away. The apostates, basically.
Well, Joseph Smith's statements about outer darkness are very encouraging, I think, because essentially he says you have to look at the sun and say it doesn't shine while you see it. I mean, you have to essentially know exactly that Jesus Christ has died for you and know a pertinent knowledge of it and reject it anyway.
Yeah.
So I really don't think I've ever met anybody that's in danger of outer darkness or come close. I mean, I really feel, I think the scriptures back me up that we are a universalist faith. I think the likelihood of you or Jeremy spending any time in outer darkness is nil. I could be, I don't, that's not a productive.
So then we're at least equal to Hitler and Jeffrey Dahmer.
Okay, no, but for argument's sake, let's say you are the worst person who's ever lived. How does that change the information that you have provided, right? If Hitler tells you the sky is blue, does that make the sky green? So the people aren't leaving the church because of Jeremy Runnell or John DeLynn as people. They're leaving the church because Jeremy Runnell and John DeLynn have called their attention to things they find very disturbing. And the reason I really resent the demonization, not just because you're a good guy, which you are, but because it represents a fragility on the part of the demonizer. It represents a weakness on the part of the argument of the faithful. You mentioned Cardinellis. I don't know when this is going to be broadcast or when this next thing is going to be broadcast, but I spoke to Cardinellis yesterday. He called me out of the blue. I've been trying to get a hold of him since they started doing those awful videos. And I let him have it in the phone conversation, but he invited me on his podcast. And so they can't shut Jim Bennett up. I'm going to go everywhere, but I'm going to go on Cardinellis and I'm going to confront him on this. Because I think the Cardinellis approach, it demonstrates a weakness in Cardinellis's argument. If you can't keep people in the church,
and that includes Kwaku, right?
I don't know if Kwaku's going to be in this podcast.
No. I mean, in terms of him also using Demonizing people like me and Jeremy.
Well, demonizing, and they literally demonized you. They put your face on a demon's body.
On someone they thought was a demon.
On someone they thought was that demonstrates weakness, not strength. That comes from a place of cowardice. When I did my reply to Jeremy, it was, look, if I have to resort to telling everybody that Jeremy Runnell is Hitler or Satan or the worst person, it means that I can't answer his arguments. And I wanted to demonstrate I can answer his arguments. I can't answer his arguments in sort of a definitive way that will ring true to everybody, but he's asking good questions. Here are my answers to those questions. And, if people go, well, okay, but we need to discredit the messenger first, so that nobody even looks at the questions. That's a fragile God. It's not the God I worship. And I believe a part of the reason I'm willing to do this and try to answer these questions and on occasion fail miserably. I mean, I know that when I engage in these kinds of things, I'm going to say stuff and step in it and I shouldn't have said that. Knew that was wrong, and that wasn't the best way to represent the church or any of that. But the reason I'm willing to do that is that I have confidence in the church's destiny. I have confidence and faith in the future that this is not a fragile God and this is not a fragile church. And the thing that Jeremy has in his introduction from J. Reuben Clark is that if we have the truth, it cannot be harmed by investigation. And if we have not the truth, it ought to be harmed. That's a true principle. That's a true principle being taught by a member of the First Presidency, by a prophet, seer, and revelator. I absolutely believe that and have confidence in that. And I would like to see people defending the church have confidence in that. Because if they have to attack you and say, well, John Dehlin eats babies for breakfast or whatever else, they've already lost the argument before it's begun. They're not building the kingdom. They're not doing the church any service by doing that. It doesn't help. It hurts. It does nothing but hurt. And it diminishes you. I mean, it diminishes the person making the argument. It diminishes, if I sit here and attack you as a person and call you names and say nasty things and put your face on a demon's body, I'm the one that looks petty and small. And if I'm representing the church while I do that, I'm making the church look petty and small. And we're better than that. We should be better than that. Everybody should be better than that. So that's where I am on that.
And then for God, why, and this comes back to the problem of evil and, the theodicy, but why is God creating this plan where so few of his children, I should say thank you for what you just said. I appreciate it. I'm sure Jeremy appreciates it too, but then just ending with kind of God, and it's hard to guess God. It's hard to second guess God. It's hard to know God's mind and will, but why, what's your thinking for why God, it's tough enough to be a Mormon. Why, how do you make sense of a plan where a PDF or a podcast seems to be taking so many people, by some people's perception, seems to be taking so many people out? What, wouldn't you have hoped that God would have put some sort of plan together where either prophets would have foreseen this and dealt with the history much differently in 1910, 1920, 1930,
right?
Or just not mishandled it all along the way, or would have taught the history differently? Like, how did we get in this mess with an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God? And I know we're going to touch on some themes we've already touched on.
No, I mean, I think we have handled this to some degree because I consider myself a universalist. I consider the fact that we all get there eventually. I don't know how long it will take. I don't know how long it will take for Hitler, if he's going to be punished for 6 billion years for each of the 6 million Jews that was murdered under his watch and on his direct order. Eternity is a very, very long time, right? And even those 6 billion years and all those kinds of things, it's a drop in the bucket to eternity. So the idea that, I think I'm answering a different question than the one you just asked.
I'm sure that's part of it.
Well,
In other words, there's nothing to worry about in the long term.
In the long term, I believe there's nothing to worry about. Yes, I take issue. I depart ways with Bruce R. McConkie's 7 Deadly Heresies, where he talks about the heresy of progression between the kingdoms. I just think, how can there not be progression between the kingdoms? How do you stop progression over a course of eternity? How do you live eternity in front of a brick wall? Does that mean that the terrestrial kingdom eventually becomes like the celestial kingdom eventually? Nobody knows any of that. We don't know. And I don't think Bruce R. McConkie knew either. I think he firmly believed what he believed, but I would disagree with him on that point. And I think I'm in good company. There are other brethren that have disagreed with him on that point. So then you come back to the question, okay, well, why hasn't the church unfolded differently than it has? Why has God allowed the church to progress the way that it has? And I don't think there is an answer to that question. I just don't think there's an answer to that anybody can provide in any substantive way. It's the Candide talks about Dr. Pangloss, who says, this is the best of all possible worlds, because there is no other world, so this must be the best of all possible worlds. And that's kind of sort of where we find ourselves, is this is the way it has unfolded. And if I were God and I were to go back, would I have chosen to have it unfold differently? Would I have gone and warned, in the CES letter reply, this example might be helpful. Jeremy gets into the whole Mark Hoffman thing. And he says, why didn't the Lord scream in the ears of these prophets, seers, and revelators that they were dealing with a fraud and a murderer? How were these men able to be deceived by somebody like Mark Hoffman? And shouldn't we expect a prophet, seer, and revelator to not be duped like that? And I think I lay out, at least in one of the versions of my reply, I say, okay, all right, let's say Mark Hoffman shows up on the doorstep of the church, and he's got these fraudulent documents, and the church leadership meets in the upper rooms of the temple, and Moroni shows up. And he says, don't mess with this Mark Hoffman. He's terrible, and this is a fraud, and this is terrible. Okay, great. So they're warned. What happens next? Well, what happens next is they come out and they say, oh, well, Mark Hoffman, he's a fraud. Moroni told us so. Well, what does Mark Hoffman do? Mark Hoffman says, you guys are nuts. I mean, Mark Hoffman is still lying and deceiving, but Mark Hoffman is a very good forger, and he gets the entire world to say these religious nuts are refusing to look at their own history based on some weird thing they're saying happened in their temple. The way that unfolds, does that unfold better than how it unfolded as it was? I'm not convinced that's the case. I'm convinced now we learn that the brethren are not perfect, and the brethren, Dallin Oaks talks about the fact that he's like, we have to deal with everybody in good faith, and we took Mark Hoffman in good faith. This speaks to our good faith. And it's like, yeah, that's right. It does speak to your good faith. So to sit here and restructure history according to how I think God should have handled it differently from the way that he did is not a productive exercise, because I think you can go down all kinds of rabbit holes, and there are things that we don't know that would have happened if things had happened differently. We don't know what all the unintended consequences of anything would be. I think the mortal experience was designed for us to come here and screw up and to learn these things the way we have learned them and the way we are learning them. God could absolutely step in and sort of give us the cheat codes for the video game of life. He doesn't do that. I don't think he ever does that for anybody. I don't think he does that for prophets, seers, and revelators, and he doesn't do that for me. And I think that's the point. That's the purpose. So, anyway.
Beautiful. All right. Well, this concludes the introductory or the substantive portions of my interview with Jim Bennett. son of former U.S. Senator Bob Bennett and author of A Faithful Reply to the CES Letter. This concludes the formal portion of my sort of believing after the CES Letter. I think it's been wonderful, and I'm so grateful. And Jim, I want to thank you. But don't go away. I have one thing to say before we end. But Jim, I just want to thank you. This has been so good, and so many people have loved it, and I've enjoyed every minute of it.
I've enjoyed every minute of it as well.
Thank you.
So
now, this, believe it or not, this may not be over because I still have pages of questions and thoughts from you, our listeners. So I'm going to talk to Jim right now about do we start right now another couple hours, or do we wait and do that later? Are we just too exhausted? but there's a decent chance we're going to have a part 5 and maybe even a part 6 of like a Q&A where we actually go into some detail just about questions from you, our listeners. So stay tuned. Don't go away. I'm thinking there's a really good chance we're going to have at least a part 5, if not more. But for those of you who joined us for this main section, thank you so much. Thanks for your support. Thanks to Jim. Thanks to Jeremy Runnell. Go to cesletter.org to read the CES Letter. Jeremy's a great guy. Just Google Jim Bennett, that's N-N-E-T-T, CES Letter response, and you'll find the Canonizer website, which then has Jim's response. Read all 300 or 400 pages of that to read his response. And go to Bill Reel, his podcast, to hear 14 hours of Bill and Jim talking about things as well. Lots of good content out there. Check it all out. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting us. Everyone who supports Mormon Stories Podcast, your donations have made this possible. Please donate. If you don't support us, less than 1 out of 1,000 of my listeners actually donate. If you want to see this content continue, if you value this content, please become a monthly donor. Just go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button, and you can support this interview and future interviews with your support. Jim, if somebody wants to support you financially, what can they do? Or do you even take donations for this kind of work?
I haven't set anything up for donations.
You should, I think.
That's a good question. I'll have to think about that. I don't have an answer for that.
Okay.
So Jim Bennett is free for the moment.
Okay.
So,
all right. Well, for the moment, we'll let you know if there's a way for you to support Jim Bennett going forward. But I will say support RFM, support Bill Reel, support Jeremy, support Open Stories Foundation. And if you're Mormon, support the LDS Church. So anyway, thanks.
They'll take donations even if you're not Mormon. So
Yeah.
Anyway,
thanks for your support. Please support us if you can. Thanks again to Jim. And if people want to thank you for your contributions, how do they reach out to you and thank you?
Well, I'll give you my email address.
Okay,
if you want to
what
send
is
me an email, it's jim@canonizer.com.
CANON.
CANONIZER.com.
And no mean, nasty emails, only kind, thoughtful, encouraging, supportive emails.
I've gotten some mean, nasty ones too. If you send me a mean, nasty one, you might get something snarky on the way back. So anyway, we'll see what happens.
All right. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you guys on the flip side. Don't go away. Come right back. And we're going to have part 5, a Q&A where I give Jim your questions and give him a chance to respond to some of his critics and those who have compliments. There's good and bad criticisms and compliments in those interviews. Thanks, everybody. See you guys again soon on another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care.